My monster-in-law gave me divorce papers at my own anniversary party. She thought I would cry and beg. Instead, I smiled and simply said, "Thank you." The whole room went completely silent. What she did not know was that I was a secret billionaire, and I had already legally taken everything from her family. Game over, Camilla. My name is Elizabeth. Exactly 1 year ago today, I married Oliver Thompson. Standing here in this bright, expensive ballroom, wearing a red dress that cost more than most people's homes, holding divorce papers tied with a silver bow, I can tell you that marrying him was not the mistake. Trusting his mother was the real error. To get to know each other better, leave your name and the city where you are watching this video in the comments. 300 of the city's most important people were gathered here. The music played softly, and champagne flowed freely. But Camilla Thompson, my mother-in-law, planned this event. She never does anything out of kindness for me. I should have known something was wrong because she wore pure white, not cream, like she was the one celebrating her own wedding. Oliver, my husband, stood right beside her like a dog waiting for a command, nodding at everything she said. The party was in full swing when Camilla tapped her champagne glass, demanding silence. I felt my stomach drop immediately. I knew that victorious look on her face, that cruel gleam in her eye. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with a falsely sweet voice, "I have a very special gift for my dear daughter-in-law." The music stopped. A bright spotlight appeared from nowhere, shining right on me. I felt every eye in the room looking at my skin. Camilla walked toward me holding a small silver box wrapped with a clean white bow. She was practically glowing with satisfaction. "Open it, dear," she cooed loud enough for everyone to hear. My hands were steady as I took the box. I slowly pulled off the bow and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on white silk, were the divorce papers. I slowly pulled off the bow and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on white silk, were the divorce papers. The heavy silence of the ballroom pressed against my eardrums. I could feel the heat of the spotlight on my neck, and the sudden, intense shift of attention from the polite social theater to genuine, aggressive curiosity. I looked at the papers, crisp and legally binding. They had Camilla's signature and a space reserved for mine. The room was holding its collective breath, waiting for the dramatic breakdown Camilla had engineered. I placed the silver box gently on the nearest table, a motion that took far too long, buying myself a crucial second. Camilla was radiant, her mouth curved in a sharp, triumphant smile. Oliver stood slightly behind her, pale and sweating, avoiding my eyes. I did not scream. I did not cry. Instead, I reached inside the hidden inner pocket of my incredibly expensive red gown. My fingers found the cool, heavy stack of papers I had prepared weeks ago, tied with a similar, perfect silver bow. I pulled them out. I held up my papers, identical in appearance to the documents Camilla had gifted me. The whispers started immediately, growing louder as the guests tried to understand the mirror image. "Camilla, this is such a thoughtful gesture," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the din, steady and calm. I spoke loud enough for the microphone she had used to carry my words across the room. "But, you know, I always believe in reciprocity." I took a sharp breath and looked straight at Oliver, who looked less like a husband and more like a frightened boy caught stealing. "These are my papers," I announced, "signed and notarized 3 weeks ago. My divorce is final." Oliver took a stumbling step back. The look of confusion on Camilla's face was the first true thing I had ever seen from her. The smile vanished, replaced by pure, ugly shock. "And since we are exchanging gifts tonight," I continued, gesturing to the entire horrified crowd, "I wanted to announce that as of this morning, Hartford Technologies has successfully acquired 100% of all outstanding Thompson family corporate debt. That means Effective immediately, Thompson Industries belongs to me. The sound was staggering. It was not a roar, but a collective gasp. The immediate, painful realization of power shifting. People started murmuring, some rushing to their phones, others staring at the Thompsons, not me. Camilla's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Oliver just stood there, completely broken. The spotlight that had been highlighting my humiliation suddenly looked like a spotlight highlighting my total, strategic victory. I did not need to say another word. I simply turned, dropped the signed papers onto Oliver's chest, and walked away from the ballroom, leaving the silence, the champagne, and the wreckage of the Thompson family behind me. 6 months later, the smell of sterile glass cleaner and expensive coffee filled the 28th floor of Hartford Tower. The Thompson saga had become exactly what Camilla had always feared. A public, spectacular failure. She was exactly where she belonged, quietly working in a small charity thrift shop far from the socialite pages. Oliver, to his credit, was trying to find his footing, working an honest job, finally free of his mother's shadow, though still haunted by it. For me, the last 6 months had been both the busiest and most rewarding of my life. The acquisition of the debt had been surgically clean, legal, and absolutely unforgiving. Hartford Technologies flourished. My new foundation, The Haven, was successful beyond expectation, providing legal and financial support for people trapped in exploitative relationships. I had proved that power and integrity could coexist. But the speed and aggression of the Thompson takeover, the sheer scale of the financial maneuvering, had made me famous in a way I never intended. The anonymity I had sought when I married Oliver was gone. I was no longer just the heir. I was Elizabeth Hartford, the woman who brought the Thompson name to its knees. This distinction brought scrutiny. I sat at the massive cherry wood table in the executive conference room, the New York skyline spread out beneath the cold, clean glass. The air conditioning was too strong, but I liked the feeling of the chill. It kept me sharp. We were reviewing the final audit of the Thompson assets, preparing them for total restructuring. "The numbers are clean, Elizabeth," stated Mr. Davies, our chief legal officer, a man whose glasses perpetually slipped down his nose. Every action was above board. We acquired the debt legally. We converted the holdings according to standard regulatory procedures. "I know it was legal, Mr. Davies," I responded, tapping a stylus on the polished surface. "But do the regulators think it was ethical?" He adjusted his glasses. "The ethics of aggressive mergers are a gray area. One you handled masterfully. The issue is political now. There are rivals who want to slow us down. This acquisition was too fast, too efficient. It made people uncomfortable." I sighed, leaning back in my leather chair. My father, Jonathan Hartford, had warned me about this exact consequence. When you move this fast and accumulate this much, people start looking for the tiny, dark thread that might unravel the whole tapestry. A small, persistent knot of tension had been growing in my stomach for weeks. It was the feeling of being hunted, even when fully protected. The corporate world was a battlefield where the weapons were paperwork and legal challenges. "Keep everything logged, Mr. Davies," I instructed, my eyes fixed on a distant cloud reflecting the afternoon light. "I want triple the documentation on the timing of the Thompson debt consolidation. No holes, not even pinpricks." Just as Mr. Davies began to speak again, the main door to the conference room opened abruptly. My executive assistant, Sarah, stood there. Sarah was unflappable, accustomed to dealing with CEOs and international diplomats, but her composure was gone. Her face was tight, her eyes wide with a worry that went beyond the usual high-stakes panic of corporate life. "Ms. Hartford," she whispered, leaning into the room, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "I apologize for the interruption, but you have 2 unexpected visitors in the reception area. They presented official identification. I sat up straight, the cool air suddenly feeling much colder. "Who is it, Sarah?" She swallowed hard, looking quickly at Mr. Davies, then back at me. "They are from the Securities and Exchange Commission, ma'am. They insist they must speak to you immediately regarding the acquisition of Thompson Industries." The moment Sarah mentioned the Securities and Exchange Commission, the temperature in the large office seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Elizabeth kept her face carefully neutral. She nodded, giving Sarah a small, brief signal. "Thank you, Sarah. Please show them into the small conference room. Mr. Davies and I will join them shortly. Please hold all calls." Deet. Sarah, looking pale and frightened by the weight of the federal agency's name, quickly left the room. Mr. Davies, her seasoned legal counsel, leaned across the desk, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "They don't send field agents unless they are serious, Elizabeth. They are not checking boxes. They are looking for a weakness." Elizabeth stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored skirt. "They will find none. Every move we made in the Thompson acquisition was by the book, Mr. Davies. Aggressive, yes, but clean. They are reacting to the sheer volume and speed of the takeover. It made noise, and noise attracts regulators. Noise, or perhaps the complaints of a few highly leveraged rivals who lost their stake in the Thompson ruin?" Davies countered softly. Elizabeth walked toward the glass wall, looking out over the sharp concrete edges of the city. "They can complain all they want. We did nothing wrong. Let's go, Mr. Davies. I want to face this directly." The two SEC representatives were exactly what Elizabeth expected. Sharp suits, severe haircuts, and expressions that conveyed professional neutrality bordering on judgment. They introduced themselves as Agent Keller and Agent Ruiz. The questioning began immediately, surgical and precise. Agent Keller took the lead. "Ms. Hartford, our primary concern involves the timeline of the Thompson Industries debt acquisition. It appears Hartford Technologies, within a period of less than 6 weeks, aggressively acquired nearly 70% of the total available debt, using a complex array of shell corporations and highly sensitive information regarding the Thompson family's insolvency timetable. We must ascertain the source of that critical, time-sensitive information. Was it gained through legal means? It was gained through public market analysis and superior strategic positioning," Elizabeth stated flatly, sitting perfectly still. "Hartford Technologies is a leader in technological market analysis. We saw an opportunity where others saw a complete collapse, and we seized it. The documentation proving the legality of every transaction is already compiled and available for your review." Agent Ruiz flipped open a binder. "And the allocation of Hartford's internal resources for this acquisition? Documents show significant capital was moved from unrelated long-term research funds to finance the final stages of the takeover. We need justification that the use of these corporate funds for a highly personal, rapid acquisition, which many perceive as retaliatory, was in the genuine best interest of Hartford Technologies shareholders." The word retaliatory hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth felt the familiar, cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was the threat. They were trying to paint her strategy as personal revenge, thinly veiled as corporate maneuver, which could lead to shareholder lawsuits or deeper probes into insider trading, even if the premise was false. The acquisition of Thompson assets was strategic, profitable, and secured a vital market segment for future growth, Elizabeth asserted. "I can assure you, agents, that while my past relationship with the Thompson family is public knowledge, my decisions concerning Hartford Technologies are solely professional, fiduciary, and ethically sound." The meeting dragged on for nearly 3 hours, a slow, methodical draining of confidence and time. When the agents finally packed up their binders, they left no promises, only a chilling statement. "We will be requesting extensive internal communication records and full access to your due diligence process, Ms. Hartford. We anticipate a thorough, ongoing investigation. Meanwhile, in a cramped two-room apartment in a less desirable part of Queens, Oliver Thompson wiped sweat from his brow. 6 months had passed since the divorce and the public implosion of his family's name. He had changed his life completely. He was working construction, saving money, and finally living a life free of his mother's demands and his family's suffocating expectations of status. It was humbling, but peaceful. He was currently clearing out the last few boxes salvaged from the remnants of his old life. Items he couldn't bear to throw away, but couldn't keep either. He dusted off a heavy, stained cardboard box, labeled in his father's hurried, angular script, R.T. Misk, Office. Oliver knelt, pulling out old tax filings, yellowed papers, and finally, a heavy, outdated laptop, its casing scuffed and worn. He remembered this laptop. Richard had insisted it was only for personal projects. Curiosity, combined with a deep, lingering guilt over his inability to protect Elizabeth from the Thompson decay, made him plug the old machine in. It groaned to life, the screen flickering green, then gray. It took him nearly 20 minutes of fumbling, but Oliver finally remembered the obscure, non-obvious password his father used for everything important. The name of the sailboat he bought when he first made real money, spelled backward. The computer unlocked, revealing a standard desktop. But Oliver noticed a folder labeled Recipes that was far too large for just recipes. He right-clicked the folder, checking its properties. It was protected by a double layer of encryption. He knew immediately this was the true vault. He spent the next 2 hours wrestling with the encryption. Oliver was never as smart as Elizabeth, but he had spent his youth watching his father handle complex transactions, and he knew Richard's obsessive patterns for hiding things. He guessed a combination of names and dates, finally hitting the right sequence. The folder burst open, not with recipes, but with thousands of tiny, compressed data files. Oliver gasped, leaning forward until his face was inches from the dim screen. He clicked the first file, an old bank statement, and scrolled down, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just evidence of poor management. This was calculated theft. There were detailed ledgers showing funds siphoned off through half a dozen shell corporations registered in obscure islands, accelerating the company's financial decline years before the public scandal hit. His father, Richard, hadn't just mismanaged the company. He had systematically hollowed it out. He saw specific dates where massive chunks of capital, the money they thought they had for restructuring, were transferred out of the Thompson coffers, often disguised as consulting fees or capital investment losses. Oliver felt sick. This explained everything. The sudden, brutal speed of the final collapse, his mother's panic, and the complete disappearance of liquid assets. Richard Thompson had been the architect of their ruin, leaving Camilla and Oliver to face the fallout. He scrolled quickly through hundreds of pages of financial maneuvering, finding the ultimate destination of the money in several massive offshore accounts. It was indisputable proof that Richard had used the company's reputation and name to steal the fortune that Elizabeth had married into, making her a victim of pure, cynical greed. Oliver felt a strange mixture of disgust and dark clarity. He had been weak and blind, but his father had been a criminal. He clicked on the final folder, labeled Communications. Inside, only a handful of files, all encrypted, but one stood out. It was a single text file dated just 3 weeks ago. He opened it, revealing a fragmented message chain, clearly between Richard and another party. The message read, Richard, they are busy with the regulators now. The old Hartford deal is the weak point. Get ready to release the documents we prepared. She will never see it coming. Oliver stared at the screen, the small room spinning around him. Richard was not just hiding. He was actively watching Elizabeth, and he was preparing a counterattack, planning to leverage the SEC investigation to hurt her. And he was using something from Elizabeth's father's past, the old Hartford deal, as bait. Oliver realized, with a sickening jolt, that his father was back in play, closer than anyone knew, ready to finish the job he started. Richard Thompson was the hidden monster, far more dangerous than Camilla had ever been. Oliver reached out a trembling hand, trying to pull up the full message string to find the identity of the person Richard was communicating with, when suddenly the old, unstable laptop screen flickered violently, displaying a single, shocking error message, and then went completely dark. He hammered the power button again and again, but the evidence, the critical link to the third party, and the full extent of Richard's plan was now locked behind a dead, black pane of glass. Oliver hammered the power button 5 times, the cheap plastic shell of the old laptop grating beneath his palm. He tried the adapter, jiggled the cord, and even slapped the base, a stupid, useless gesture born of pure, cold panic. The screen remained dead, a black mirror reflecting his own horrified face. He realized the timing was impossible. Richard had revealed the key piece of his strategy, the old Hartford deal, and the machine had immediately died, taking the full message and the identity of the accomplice with it. He carefully lifted the laptop, noticing the burnt, dusty scent of failing electronics. It felt heavy and worthless. He knew enough to understand that the hard drive might still hold the data, but he could not take it to any public repair shop. The message was already too dangerous. Sliding it quickly under the bed, he felt a frantic need to move, to tell someone, but he had nothing concrete left, only a memory of 2 lines of text, the threat to Elizabeth and the mention of her father's past. Oliver stood up, wiping the cold sweat from his temples. He needed Camilla. She was the only other person who knew Richard's true capacity for cruelty, and she was the only one who might know Richard's current location or associates, even if she claimed she was staying out of it. He had to choose his next step carefully, knowing that bringing this to Elizabeth without evidence would sound like the desperate ramblings of a failed ex-husband trying to interfere. 2 days later, the pressure on Elizabeth had intensified into a boiling point. The SEC investigation had moved from cautious inquiry to aggressive questioning, demanding comprehensive audits and internal communications regarding the Thompson acquisition strategy. Elizabeth was in the main conference room at Hartford Technologies, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows showing the gray, relentless cityscape of Lower Manhattan. She sat opposite her head of compliance, Michael, who looked pale and overworked. The air in the room was thick and still, chilled by the overly efficient air conditioning. They want the entire 6-month history of communications regarding the restructuring debt, Michael said, his voice quiet. Specifically, they are questioning the speed of the acquisition. The word predatory has been used, Elizabeth. Elizabeth leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. The speed was necessary, Michael. Every move was above board, and every lawyer signed off. They know that. This is politics, not legality. Just as Michael opened his mouth to reply, a sudden, sharp flurry of alerts erupted in the room. Her phone, Michael's tablet, and the massive monitor at the end of the table all simultaneously displayed the same alarming headlines. The leak was instantaneous and devastating. The front page of every major financial news outlet screamed the same accusation. Hartford CEO leverages Thompson bankruptcy to conceal father's financial history, followed by new documents suggest Thompson takeover was an elaborate cover-up of 20-year-old Hartford fraud. Elizabeth snatched her tablet and scrolled quickly through the article. The documents Richard had leaked were clearly manufactured or heavily manipulated, but they contained just enough specific jargon and dates to appear credible. The core accusation was that the money used by Hartford Technologies to buy up the Thompson debt had been laundered through a series of shell companies decades earlier by her father, Jonathan Hartford. The timing of the aggressive takeover, the article suggested, was intended to bury the entire financial history before regulators could dig it up. Elizabeth felt a cold, deep dread settle in her stomach. It wasn't the lie that shocked her. It was the precision. Richard hadn't just made something up. He had gone digging in the past, finding a legitimate weak spot. She stared at a blurry photocopy included in the online article, allegedly an old ledger page. On it, typed small and official-looking, was the name of a corporation she hadn't heard mentioned since she was a child. ELYTE Holdings. ELYTE Holdings. That name referred to an obscure, short-lived partnership her father had dissolved over 20 years ago, long before she even knew how to manage a checking account. If Richard knew about ELYTE, he knew secrets that even most Hartford executives had forgotten. This was not the work of a disgruntled ex-mother-in-law looking for status. This was a professional attempt at character assassination and corporate sabotage, aimed at the foundation of the Hartford name itself. "This is not a political maneuver, Michael," Elizabeth stated, her voice dangerously low. "This is personal. And that name, ELYTE, is a deep, deep cut. Richard Thompson is doing this, and he is trying to burn my father's legacy to the ground." The SEC, already breathing down their necks, now had official, if falsified, documents pointing to potential historical fraud. The investigation immediately shifted focus, escalating into a full-scale corporate crisis. Her phone was ringing constantly. Her father's name, already slightly tarnished by years of aggressive old-school business, was now being openly questioned in every media cycle. Elizabeth spent the next 72 hours in a tactical war room, ignoring sleep, coordinating legal teams across 4 states, all while fielding calls from board members terrified of the financial market's reaction. She felt exposed, not because of what she had done, which was legal and clean, but because Richard was fighting a war based purely on perception and historical smear, a field where absolute truth rarely mattered more than a convincing headline. Just as the legal team was preparing a sweeping injunction against the outlets publishing the leaked documents, her head of security, an imposing woman named Dana, quietly entered the room. Elizabeth motioned for a break, and the room emptied quickly, leaving only the two of them. Dana didn't speak immediately. She simply walked up to Elizabeth's spot at the table and placed a single sheet of paper down. It was a photograph, grainy and taken from a distance, clearly pulled from a security feed. It showed the entry point of a private rental facility near Newark. The photo featured a man in the foreground. He was lean, dressed plainly, wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a thick, inexpensive canvas jacket. He was slightly hunched over, his face mostly obscured, but the familiar posture and the sharp angle of his jaw were undeniable. Elizabeth felt the air leave her lungs. Richard Thompson was supposed to be hiding in some unnamed foreign country, running from his ruin. Yet, here he was. "This was taken 3 days ago, off the private jet terminal records," Dana said, her voice a rough whisper. "He cleared customs under a borrowed identity, using a fake passport and a small charter." Elizabeth picked up the photo, her hand shaking slightly. The shock wasn't just that he was back, but how close he was, operating under her very nose. Richard was not remote. He was actively here, directing the chaos. "Dana," Elizabeth managed, her throat tight. "Find Oliver. Now. He knows something." Richard reached out to him first. "I know it." Dana nodded grimly. "We're already tracking him. But there's something else." Dana leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower, and she pointed to a small detail in the corner of the photograph, just behind Richard Thompson. There was a vehicle visible, a dark, late-model sedan. The license plate was blurred, but the small, specific logo affixed to the trunk was clear. The stylized crown belonging to Thompson family's old, defunct real estate holding company. A company that Elizabeth knew had been controlled exclusively by one person for the last 40 years. We ran the plate against the last registered owner. Once we focused the image, Dana concluded, her eyes wide with concern. The car belongs to Camilla Thompson. Elizabeth felt the coldness spread through her veins, a stark contrast to the heat of the boardroom. It was not shock, it was recognition. Camilla had not changed. She was still bound to the gilded cage, even if the gold had flaked away. So she made her choice, Elizabeth said, her voice flat, devoid of the previous tension. She stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her impeccable skirt. She chose the past, the fantasy of status Richard offered, over the peace she finally found working at that charity shop. Dana looked defeated. We don't know the extent of her involvement, Elizabeth. Maybe she just loaned him the car. Maybe she was threatened. That car is a symbol of everything Richard stole, Dana. Camilla knows that. It doesn't matter if she drove it or if she only gave him the keys. She is complicit. And now Richard has his shield. Elizabeth moved to the panoramic window, looking out over the concrete and glass battlefield of Midtown. Richard Thompson's attack had been swift and calculated. He had filed injunctions claiming Elizabeth's aggressive acquisition of the Thompson debt was a classic example of corporate predatory behavior, aiming to strip the family legacy bare. He used the ongoing SEC investigation, hinting broadly that Hartford Technologies had fabricated financial distress to grab the assets for cents on the dollar. The media was eating it up. Richard, the prodigal father, was suddenly recast as the desperate savior, fighting against the cold, heartless billionaire, Elizabeth Hartford. We have to move before the market reacts to the formal charges he filed this morning, Elizabeth stated, turning back to Dana. A standard legal fight against Richard will take months, and the SEC will freeze our assets in the meantime, citing potential impropriety. We don't have months. What's the alternative? We can't just give him the company back. Elizabeth walked slowly back to the massive mahogany table and picked up her phone, pressing the speed dial for her personal driver. We stop fighting his battle and start fighting ours. Richard's greatest weakness is that he built his current defense on the same lies that destroyed the family years ago. Oliver found the proof of that embezzlement. We need Oliver. Within the hour, Elizabeth was in a quiet, less trafficked neighborhood in the East Village. She dismissed her security detail 2 blocks away. She found the address easily, a small 5-story walk-up. Oliver's apartment was cramped, but clean, smelling faintly of coffee and old books. It was the first honest space he had ever lived in. He was waiting for her, sitting rigidly on the edge of a worn sofa, looking profoundly tired. There was a small, dusty hard drive sitting on the coffee table between them. Camilla was sitting opposite him, leaning back against the wall, her arms crossed tight. Her expression was complicated, a mix of fear, old resentment, and a newfound, fragile neutrality. Elizabeth did not offer greetings or condolences. She skipped straight to the point, her voice low and focused. Richard launched his attack. It is designed to dismantle everything I built and everything you are trying to build. He is using the SEC inquiry to claim moral injury and financial fraud on our part. He is requesting a legal ruling to claw back the restructured assets, claiming they were acquired via coercion and undervalued significantly. Oliver paled. He's trying to get the company back? No, Elizabeth corrected softly. He is trying to seize the liquid assets, the last remnants of the company, and then vanish again, leaving you all to hold the wreckage. He doesn't care about the company, Oliver. He never did. He only cares about the cash flow that Elizabeth Hartford is currently generating for the restructured Thompson entity. Camilla finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. He promised me things. He said I would be recognized again. that I wouldn't have to sell dusty things to charity cases anymore. Elizabeth ignored the plea for pity. She looked directly at Camilla. He contacted you, didn't he? He offered you the illusion of your old life. He used your car to meet with his legal team. You are already an accessory to his fraud and his obstruction of a federal investigation. Camilla flinched as if struck. I didn't know he was doing all this. He just said it was paperwork. It doesn't matter what you knew, Elizabeth pressed, turning her full attention back to Oliver. You are the key. Richard's entire defense is based on the idea that the company's downfall was a natural economic failure exploited by me. The encrypted data you found shows exactly how and when Richard siphoned off the capital, how he embezzled the money and accelerated the bankruptcy for his own gain years ago. It's the truth. Elizabeth leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. The air in the small room felt thick and suffocating. Richard has given the press and the regulators 2 days of chaos before his legal action becomes irrevocable. I can't stop him with my lawyers alone. But if we release your evidence to the SEC, if you publicly testify about Richard's years of theft, we not only discredit his entire position, but we turn the focus of the federal investigation entirely onto him. She pushed a plain manila envelope across the table. It contained 2 signed contracts. This is the ultimatum, Oliver. 1, a full public exposure of Richard Thompson's decade of embezzlement using your data. 2, this envelope contains papers that guarantee Camilla genuine financial security and anonymity, enough to live comfortably forever, if she corroborates key details about Richard's operations and vouches for your testimony. Oliver stared at the hard drive, then at the envelope, his jaw working silently. His choice was absolute. Protect his father and the rotten structure of the Thompson name, or choose truth, integrity, and finally, genuine freedom for himself and his mother. Richard will never let me live, Oliver whispered, his eyes wide. You are free already, Elizabeth countered sharply. Richard will never be able to touch you or Camilla again, not if he is in prison. But if he wins this week, he will own you both through fear and manipulation, forever. This is the only way out, Oliver. The final decision is yours, the hard drive or the lie. We do this now. We go public in the next 6 hours. Oliver slowly reached out a trembling hand and closed his fingers around the small, heavy hard drive. He looked at his mother, who was watching him with fearful, expectant eyes, her entire future dependent on the courage she had never taught him to possess. He looked at Elizabeth, seeing not the scorned ex-wife, but the strategic mind offering him the only real opportunity for peace he had ever known. He gripped the drive tight, took a deep breath that rattled in his chest, and slowly pushed the manila envelope containing his mother's potential freedom toward Camilla. He looked at Elizabeth. I need your team to prepare the statement, Oliver said, his voice stronger than Elizabeth had ever heard it. I will testify. But my mother must agree too. It's all or nothing. Camilla slowly picked up the envelope, her eyes darting between her son and the woman who held all the power. Oliver had chosen truth over family obedience. Now it was her turn. She glanced down at the envelope and then back up at Oliver, a single, clear tear tracking through the old makeup on her cheek. I will tell them everything about the accounts he set up in the Bahamas, Camilla said, her voice cracking. I want it over. Elizabeth nodded once, a cold sense of triumph mixed with profound relief settling over her. Oliver, get the data encrypted and uploaded. Dana will be waiting for the files. Camilla, we need every detail. The clock starts now. We are going to destroy Richard Thompson. The heavy silence that followed Elizabeth's order was louder than any shouting. Oliver immediately went to work, his movements mechanical. He placed his old laptop, the device holding the evidence that would finally free him, but destroy his last living parent, onto the large mahogany table. His fingers, still visibly shaking, navigated the encrypted files he had spent weeks pulling from the family archives. The room, which had been bright just an hour before, felt small and overheated. Elizabeth instructed a guard to bring water and coffee, then pulled a small recorder from her briefcase and placed it in front of Camilla. "Camilla, we need a clean, clear timeline. Start with the first contact Richard made. Everything he promised you. Every account name you remember." Camilla did not reach for the coffee. She sat hunched, her shoulders slumped, making her small frame seem even smaller against the massive leather chair. She looked like a woman who had just finished running a marathon she never wanted to start. The old makeup she had carefully applied that morning was now streaked and uneven. "He called 3 months ago," Camilla started, her voice rough, a dry whisper. "He said he knew I was living in a slum. He said you were a predator, Elizabeth. He was going to expose you, make you pay for humiliating me." As Camilla spoke, Oliver worked. The clicking of the keyboard provided a tense rhythm to the confession. He was sweating, not from the temperature of the room, but from the realization that every key press finalized his divorce from the Thompson name. He watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, indicating the secure upload to Dana's servers. Each percentage point felt like a physical weight lifting from his chest, replaced by a cold, sharp grief. He had gained a future, but he had lost the ability to ever look back. Elizabeth interrupted Camilla only for clarification. She wanted facts, figures, and direct confirmation that Richard was using the chaos of the SEC investigation to reacquire the assets at a low price, planning to disappear again. Camilla revealed the names of the banks, the shell corporations, and the secret drop points Richard was using in New York. She spoke with a brutal efficiency, driven by the desire to secure the safety Elizabeth had promised. A quiet, anonymous life free from fear. When the progress bar reached 100%, Oliver let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The sound was like a small sob. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. "It's sent," he murmured, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Elizabeth checked her phone immediately. A moment later, a confirmation text from Dana arrived. "Data is pristine. Moving now." Elizabeth looked up at Oliver, then at Camilla, whose confession was reaching its emotional peak. "That is enough for now, Camilla. My team will take over. Oliver, I need you to stay here. They will need a formal statement and likely your testimony." The legal team moved with the speed of a surgical strike. Within the hour, Elizabeth's phone buzzed constantly, detailing the execution. The encrypted ledger from Oliver, combined with Camilla's detailed confession of Richard's immediate plans and hiding spots, provided the federal agents with an undeniable case. Richard Thompson, convinced he was steps ahead of everyone, was cornered in a nondescript financial office downtown, preparing to make the final legal move to seize the restructured Thompson assets. He was arrested on charges of massive fraud and embezzlement, the news traveling through the corporate world like a shockwave. The internal pressure on Hartford Technologies immediately vanished. The SEC investigation, which had been fueled by Richard's leaks and falsified documents, lost all traction. Elizabeth's swift, aggressive takeover of the Thompson debt, while still unconventional, was confirmed as clean, simply leveraging the failure Richard had created. The old, politically motivated charges Richard had resurrected against Elizabeth's father crumbled completely. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, dusty shadows across the floor of the Hartford conference room, the war was over. Camilla had been quietly moved to a secure location where she could rest before facing the reality of providing formal testimony. Oliver and Elizabeth were alone. The empty coffee cups and scattered notes were the only physical remnants of the dramatic turn of events. Oliver stood and walked to the window, looking out over the evening lights of Manhattan. The victory was immense, but it felt hollow to him. Elizabeth joined him, standing a small distance away. She was calm now, the fierce concentration gone, replaced by a weary satisfaction. "You saved Hartford Technologies today, Oliver," she said simply. He shook his head, still gazing at the city. "I didn't save anything. I just cleaned up the mess my family made. The truth is, I should have done this 5 years ago. I should have protected you from them." She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time since their wedding. He looked tired, but for the first time, he looked strong. The shadow of his mother and father was finally gone from his face. "You couldn't then," Elizabeth stated. "You weren't ready to risk the safety of the known lie. You are now. That's growth, Oliver. That is the only victory that matters to you." He turned, facing her. His eyes were clear, free of the confusion and guilt she had been so familiar with. "I know what you are doing is right, Elizabeth," he said softly. "The foundation, the way you use the power. It's what you always said you would do. I messed up the marriage, but I don't regret who you became because of it." There was no romance, no flicker of their past life, only an honest respect born out of shared destruction. "And you?" Elizabeth asked. "What happens now?" Oliver smiled, a thin, genuine expression. "I testify, I give my statement, and then I get to choose a quiet life. A life where I make my own decisions, good or bad. I'll start fresh. No trust funds, no expectations, just work." Elizabeth nodded slowly, a deep, painful relief settling in her stomach. The need to protect herself from him, from his weakness, was gone. The Thompson chapter was closed, sealed by Oliver's own hand. "Good luck, Oliver," she said. "You too, Elizabeth. Keep fighting the good fight." He gave her a single respectful nod, a final acknowledgement of their shared history and their now definitively separate futures, and then walked toward the door. Elizabeth watched until he was gone, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The silence returned, complete and absolute. She stood alone in the dark room, the most powerful woman in the city, but utterly exhausted by the long strategic necessity of justice. The victory felt earned, but the cost, the complete removal of every anchor to her past life, was heavy. She picked up the discarded recording device, knowing the true work, the building of the new world, was only just beginning. 6 weeks later, the chaos had been surgically resolved. Richard Thompson, exposed by the combination of Oliver's digital evidence and Camilla's detailed, albeit reluctant, testimony, was detained in a federal holding facility, facing charges related to massive fraud and the systematic embezzlement that had destroyed the Thompson Corporation years before. The subsequent media frenzy was intense, but short-lived, quickly overshadowed by the definitive proof of his guilt. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigation concluded that while Elizabeth's acquisition strategy regarding the Thompson debt was aggressive, it was entirely legal and strategically clean. The falsified documents Richard had leaked, attempting to link Elizabeth's father, Jonathan Hartford, to an old financial scandal, were easily dismissed as fabrication designed to leverage the regulatory pressure. The cloud that had threatened Hartford Technologies was lifted. Jonathan Hartford's legacy remained pristine, and Elizabeth's standing within the corporate world was solidified. She was no longer just the heir. She was the survivor who had cleaned up the mess left by greed, proving that she could fight the dirtiest fights without getting dirty herself. Oliver, maintaining the quiet life he had chosen, testified accurately and honestly. His reward was not financial. He had refused any payment, but the internal peace that came from finally breaking the toxic chain of family obligation. He was free to build a life based on his own efforts. Camilla, in her small apartment, found a strange sense of stability. Richard's betrayal, his ultimate view of her as nothing more than a temporary tool, had extinguished the last flicker of her desire to return to the false status of her past life. The security agreement Elizabeth provided allowed her comfortable, anonymous existence. She continued her work at the charity shop, finding that the daily, simple interactions were far less stressful than the high-stakes manipulation she had once thrived upon. She was quiet now, mostly content. Elizabeth shifted her focus entirely to growth. The Thompson assets, restructured and managed under a newly created, highly transparent subsidiary, began to flourish. But the true heart of her work was the foundation. It expanded dramatically, incorporating not only support for victims of toxic, exploitative relationships, but also launching major initiatives focused on corporate transparency and ethical finance education. 2 years after that climactic night, Elizabeth sat in her private office, 50 stories above the rushing streets of Manhattan. The room was not ostentatious. The decor was clean, sharp, and purposeful. The huge glass wall offered a view of the city that seemed infinite, a landscape of possibilities that she had fought hard to command. She was reviewing the annual report for the foundation, a thick document filled with success stories and financial data that made her chest feel tight with genuine pride. The money was being used correctly, serving as a shield for those who needed it most. She traced the cover with one finger, remembering the younger woman who had disguised herself as a simple marketing manager, desperate to prove that she was worthy of simple, unearned affection. That person was gone. The disguise was irrelevant now. She had learned, perhaps brutally, that love and power were not mutually exclusive, but that power required absolute clarity and constant vigilance. The old distrust was still a quiet hum in the background, a scar, not an open wound. She knew now that her life would always be strategic. She had to analyze people, assess risks, and plan 3 steps ahead. That was the price of the absolute power she wielded. But she had also proved her original thesis. Kindness and integrity could coexist with that power, provided that the power was constantly directed toward justice. She put the report down. The sun was setting, painting the skyscrapers in tones of orange and silver. Elizabeth Hartford stood, walking toward the window. The reflection staring back at her was that of a powerful woman, strategic, guarded, and wholly self-possessed. She had taken control of her narrative and, in doing so, had created a legacy that would protect others from the kind of destructive greed that had nearly swallowed her whole. The fighting was over. The building had begun. She smiled, a small, genuine expression of hard-won peace. We have reached the end. If you can, rate this story with a score from 0 to 10 here in the comments.